Hello and welcome to D Group. This is week 6 in our study through the Gospel of Mark, 100% Jesus. And this week we're going to look at an amazing, a mysterious, just a supernatural experience with huge implications to the gospel. Remember, we talked about last week how in end of chapter 8 and first of 9, we see the gospel coming down to a real slow, deliberate, cautious pace because Jesus is teaching so many important things about the gospel, not only his death, burial, and resurrection, but what a true disciple should do in response to that, to carry their own cross and deny themselves, to admire him and his work and his glory. And then he, 6 days later, he takes them and they experience a real stunning event, a reality that really gives a greater understanding to the character and nature of God. So this actually is our first question. What does this passage say about God? Before we read it, I want you to know the kingdom of God is coming in power, just as he promised. He promised it in the law of Moses, and he promised it in the prophets. And now we're going to see Moses, the writer of the Pentateuch, the law of God, and Elijah, the king of prophets. And you're going to learn, we're going to see that God is a covenant-making and a covenant-keeping God, just as he said through Moses, a recording of what God said to Abraham in Genesis 12. All the nations of the world will be blessed. Moses wrote that, and now, thousands of years later, he and Jesus appear together on the same mountain. This is really a mountaintop experience. And so Jesus is teaching and reminding his disciples that this is where true power lives. This is where true power comes from. And this experience also shares a lot about the glory of God and the overlap in between the gospel of God and the glory of God. God has in mind to share his glory with not only his son, but also his son's disciples. God intends to reveal and to share his glory. That's the kind of God we have. And like no other God, this is a God who shares his glory and keeps his promises and then allows us to get to be a part of it. Let's read the passage together and then we'll come back and answer the 3 other questions in just a moment.
Mark 9, 2-13. After 6 days, Jesus took Peter, James, and John and led them up on a high mountain by themselves to be alone. He was transformed in front of them, and his clothes became dazzling, extremely white as no launder on earth could whiten them. Elijah appeared to them with Moses, and they were talking with Jesus. Then Peter said to Jesus, "Rabbi, it's good for us to be here. Let us make 3 tabernacles, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah," because he didn't know what else he should say, since they were terrified. A cloud appeared, overshadowing them, and a voice came from the cloud, "This is my beloved Son, listen to him." Then suddenly, looking around, they no longer saw anyone with them except Jesus alone. As they were coming down from the mountain, he ordered them to tell no one what they'd seen until the Son of Man had risen from the dead. They kept this word to themselves, discussing, "Rising from the dead, what does that mean?" Then he began to question him, "Why do the scribes say that Elijah must come first? Elijah does come first and restores everything." He replied, "How then is it written about the Son of Man that he must suffer many things and be treated with contempt? But I tell you that Elijah really has come, and they did whatever they pleased to him, just as it was written about him."
Well, let's answer the last 3 questions. Question number 2 we always ask is, what does this passage say about the gospel? Well, as we've said before, these are cautious and deliberate moments where Jesus is teaching his disciples about the gospel. And one of the things we see more clearly perhaps in this passage than any other is how the glory of God and the gospel of God seem to overlap. See, the gospel is not good news without glory, and the glory is not glorious without the gospel. So the gospel is how Jesus allows his disciples to participate in God's glory. One of the most amazing things about God is that he shares his glory. He allows people to be a part of his glory. And what's amazing is the gospel is not just about justification of sins. It is that when you receive Christ's gift of life and forgiveness and grace, then you are immediately justified and made perfect before God, and you will spend eternity with him in heaven, and that's good news. But that's not all of it. What we're seeing here is that God reveals his glory, and the disciples are transformed by being a part of it. When we share in God's glory, it's when we are not only in worship of God, which you know can be glorious, but also
when we're in service to God and when we're serving Him, when we're doing what Jesus does, we begin to experience that same kind of transfiguration glory that the disciples did. Well, the third question is, what does the passage say about us? Well, through His teachings, through His miracles, and now through His transfiguration, Jesus shows His disciples that the source and the peak of their glory is found in Him. And they are overwhelmed. They were terrified. Peter shows us something else about ourselves, is that when we're overwhelmed by God's glory, we will often recommend things that are not necessarily according to God's desire or God's will. We'll unnecessary plans and actions, and we get busy because the glory of God's so profound that we want to do something. But what I love about this passage is I think this is Jesus saying to His disciples, because of the overlap of God's glory and God's grace and the gospel, we now know that the glory of God can be revealed in us and through us. And we'll discover that when we get involved in serving God the way Jesus did and worshiping God. Just like we said last week, being a disciple is doing what Jesus does, carrying our cross. If Jesus is a servant, I will serve. If Jesus reaches out to the outcast, I will reach out to the outcast. If He demonstrates love and care, then I will demonstrate love and care. Because He sacrifices, I will sacrifice. And when I take up my cross, and when I offer my body as a living sacrifice, this is my act of worship. I experience the glory of God. And that's what we have got to begin to experience as disciples of Jesus Christ. Well, what specific action will I take as a result of this new insight? Well, I have to learn to experience and understand that this power, this glory, it comes from God alone. My commitment is that I would serve just like Jesus served, the outcast of society as well as the powerful, and that I would remember that my Christian life is a balance in between clearly what Jesus is experiencing here as a mountaintop experience, but they don't stay on the mountaintop. They go back down to the valley to serve and to sacrifice and to give, and eventually for Jesus to die. So what this teaches me is that I have to surrender my agenda to Jesus, and I have to let Him lead me to know how I can best serve Him so I can experience His glory. And so when I face trials, when I serve like Jesus served, when I worship God in spirit and in truth, then I begin to experience a deeper glory and a deeper significance than I will ever be able to discover in this world by myself. So I have got to get in the habit of seeing things from a spiritual perspective, an eternal perspective. Well, I hope you've seen through this experience on the Mount of Transfiguration with Jesus and Moses and Elijah and these disciples that God's got a great plan in mind. And we don't know what that plan is, and that's what faith requires, but we will follow and be obedient as disciples of Jesus Christ, experience this shared glory, and experience what it means to belong to God's mission. I hope you have a great discussion. I hope you've come up with ideas and concepts that I haven't even thought about, and I will see you next week.